Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I'm doing a quick review of Queen Victoria by Lucy Worsley. I think this is my last Victober read, and I wanted to read a piece of nonfiction about Queen Victoria. If you saw my Saturday Hodgepodge video, you saw that I developed a little bit of a crush on the young Victoria, a crush that was somewhat affected by what I read later in the book. Essentially in this book, Lucy Worsley attempts to answer the question about who was Queen Victoria, and do we like her or not? Is she someone to be admired? Is she someone to be vilified? Is she someone to be pitied? Is she someone to be hated? Those are the questions I think she attempts to answer. Lucy Worsley is a well-known historian in England. She appears on television as a presenter of information about history, particularly involving the English royal family. She's published a number of books. She's the curator of Palace Museum. She is definitely an expert in history, particularly on the history of the English monarchy. But this is a popular history. You know, it is a biography intended to be read by a non-academic audience. It does come complete with all the academic paraphernalia. There are endnotes, there's a bibliography. She's clearly done her research and she clearly is an expert, but she's attempted to create an accessible biography of Queen Victoria, I think in an attempt to kind of whittle the subject of who Queen Victoria was and how we feel about her to a manageable size that, you know, lots of people could consume. And I think she's done a really admirable job. Essentially, in the book, Ms. Worsley takes the approach of picking 24 days from Queen Victoria's life and talking about Queen Victoria on those days, at those points in her life, but also expanding beyond those days to what was going on in England or the monarchy or her family around that. So we learn about the day of Queen Victoria's birth, the death of her father, and how that affected the rest of her life and her relationship with her mother. We learn, you know, perhaps of some almost neglectful cruelty in an attempt to, by Queen Victoria's political handlers and her mother to keep her reputation free of being tainted. We learn about her ascension to the throne, about her coronation, which I thought was described so beautifully. I actually felt myself welling up a little bit in a description of that coronation, about, you know, how bold and brave the young Queen Victoria was. Then we learn about her courtship with Albert, her marriage to Albert, and how she essentially subjugated herself to Albert during their marriage, and she took on and almost played out an extreme version of, you know, what was the time period that thought to be the middle class model, where a woman subjected herself to the rule of her husband and she attempted to be a good wife and mother. And during that time, you know, Albert did a lot of the work of the monarch, even though he wasn't king or even the king consort. She just kind of turned everything over to him. We learn about her relationship with Albert, the good and the bad. We learn a lot about Albert that I think is actually in some ways more damaging than what we learn about Queen Victoria. We learn about them as parents, their family life, you know, how Queen Victoria was not really a doting mother, and at various points in her life she appeared to be more bothered by her kids than loving to her kids. How Prince Albert's death devastated Queen Victoria, left her kind of without any kind of companionship, and then how she kind of emerged from that to become a fairly modern style queen who seemed to be almost naturally in tune with what her people wanted and what her people expected to see from a monarch. She was an imperialist and she embraced the ideas of imperialism, and yet she oftentimes was seen or took positions or supported people across racial lines while being very judgmental of members of her own family. How by the time of her death she was a beloved queen who most people, you know, viewed positively, in part because she seemed so much like them. You know, there are a few myths about Queen Victoria that Ms. Worsley attempts to explode. The idea that her marriage to Albert was one of just absolute happiness and devotion. They were both devoted to one another, but they were frequently at odds, at loggerheads with one another about Queen Victoria and how devastated she was by Albert's death, which she was, but she did manage to go on and to exercised the powers of the monarch such as they were in an effective way. You know, the idea we get of Queen Victoria as this kind of short, fat, jowly woman really is a product of her health reasons. She became essentially immobile and gained weight. I did think that a lot of Miss Worsley's choices were really interesting and yet brought a lot of interest in humanity to what went on. There's a lot of discussion of plumbing and how plumbing led to typhoid fever. There's quite a discussion of what Queen Victoria ate and how healthy her appetite was. There's a discussion of her ideas about child rearing. There are a lot of really kind of interesting factoids, and she essentially talks about all the major things that you may or may not know about Queen Victoria. It's a good biography. I liked it. I liked the writing. I liked the choices she made. You know, I like the fact that you got kind of a broad view of Queen Victoria and her reign and who she was as a person without necessarily having to get into all the minutiae of every single detail and event that happened during her reign as queen, which would have been and is probably a much longer book. Anyway, I like the book, the biography of Queen Victoria. If you're interested in royal family biographies and Queen Victoria, I think this is a great place to start. You can get a basic idea of Queen Victoria and who she was and some of the elements of her reign and some of the challenges she overcame. And then if you want to dive more deeply into specific events or specific decisions she made, you can do that in other biographies. Anyway, thanks for watching. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below.